Okay, so I want to talk to you about my experiences of implementing continuous delivery in Windows. And when I was growing up, we always used to have story time after lunch, so I feel that this is appropriate right here. I've been in the .NET environment for the last 10 years. And usually when I tell people that, they kind of look at me with pity and say, oh, poor you. And then when I say, well, last couple of years I've been trying to do continuous delivery, they just go, oh, really poor you. So I'll tell you a little bit about me. This is a map of the world. Apparently it's wrong. England is too big on this map, but I don't know, I'd like to think it's that big. I'm from Leeds, which is why I don't sound like the Queen or from the BBC. And this is where I currently live, which means that because this is a high altitude of like 1,500 meters, for the next couple of days at least, I'm going to be able to run like Superwoman because I have really like high blood cell count. So as I say, I've been in .NET for 10 years. And every time I talk about doing DevOps and CD in .NET, this is the response I get, which isn't that helpful. So before I kind of get into this, I wanted to get a feel in the room for who we have in the room. So put your hand up if you consider yourself an ops person. There's just a couple of you guys. That's good to know. What about a developer? I'm assuming that's everyone else. Yay. OK, who's in Windows? Oh, yes. My friends are here. So you've probably experienced some of the things I'm going to talk about. So I'm going to do a very, very quick talk about continuous delivery. I'm not going to explain what it is, because that's not really what we're here for, but I am going to explain why we do it. Because this is such an absolute ball ache in Windows, it's always good to remind yourself, why am I actually doing this, as I slam my head against the keyboard screen again, or the screen, or the keyboard. So the whole point, if anyone saw Jez's talk yesterday, it's really just about getting fast feedback from users. So basically, if your software isn't in production, no one's using it and no one cares. But in terms of operations, it's about reducing risk. So if you put in big chunks of functionality and try and integrate big chunks of functionality, you're going to have lots of pain, and it's going to be a risky release. I've spent lots of releases in my career, spending a whole weekend trying to release something and it not working, and then spending the next weekend or the next couple of days trying to roll it back to try and do the same thing the weekend after. And that's because of these big chunks of work. And so we want to put lots of nice little chunks of work in. And it's like, great, this is good in theory. I want real project progress as well, because dev done doesn't mean anything, QA done doesn't mean anything, done. When it's actually in production, that's what it means. But continuous delivery is really big. You need to have the right kind of architecture. You need to have unit testing, integration testing, acceptance testing, smoke testing. You need CI. You need to manage your configuration. You need to manage your data. You need to manage your environments. This stuff is not straightforward. And organizations are like, yeah, this continuous delivery, it sounds really awesome. Can I have it, please? And it's like, yeah, this is really hard. And they say, or at least Jez, I've heard him say, but tooling's a solved problem. It's just all the problems are really around this, like, how you're going to manage your releases and how you're going to set up your organization. This is your real problem space. And I always say, not in Windows. It's harder than that in Windows, and there are still some tooling issues there. So I'm going to talk about a couple of things, or how I break up the problem space, essentially, is into this. I'm going to talk about build. So how do you build and package the application? How do you deploy it? And how do you provision environments in .NET? And some of these are solved problems. The problem is just that you're using the wrong tool. And some of these are genuinely problems that still exist. So let's start with what we're actually trying to achieve and a standard build pipeline, where you've got setting up the environment, running your unit tests, integration, functional tests, and deploying your environment. And you can do these in different stages. Maybe you deploy, then you run your tests. And this is Go, for those that haven't seen it. Both Go and TeamCity are great orchestration tools that you can use in Windows that will allow you to plug into a bunch of other tools and do continuous delivery. And when Jez talks about what we're doing when we create this build and deployment pipeline is you're basically setting up a bunch of challenges. And I've heard him describe it as like a knight, like doing all these challenges before he saves the city and wins the girl at the end. And so all of these things are like evil dragons that are trying to eat you at some point. And maybe you're really, really crap at slaying dragons and you die, your software dies right at the start. Let's start with build, which is just this little bit here, because this is the easy bit. This is a solved problem, at least in my opinion anyway. And what's happening under the hood of build is I want to be able to check in, compile my unit tests, package up my software. Sorry, not compile. I want to compile, I want to run my unit tests, and I want to package up my software. Simple. And the fundamental part of this is continuous integration, and that's the practice. So anyone that was in Jez's talk yesterday would see that in the whole room there was only like 5 people who were actually practicing continuous integration. People that were actually checking in, every single person in the team was checking in. The build wasn't broken for longer than 10 minutes. And they were all doing that every day. And you can use, as I say, TeamCity and Go for this. But please don't use TFS. And I will get onto TFS shortly. I'm only going to do one slide on it, because last time I gave this talk, I was told that my hate for TFS was too strong. And I had to be more, what's the word? I don't know. I had to rant less. I had to turn it down. So I'm just going to do one slide on what's wrong with TFS. But the build tools and the source control management tools, they're there. They exist. This is a solved problem. Build, you can use TFS or Perforce or Mercurial, or you can use anything you want to check in your code. And I would recommend using TeamCity or Go. But I'd first like to talk about the fact that one of the key takeaways, I think, is the idea of the CI being a build and deployment orchestration tool. And this will lead me on to why TFS sucks. There was a team, a client that I went on to that said, yes, we would like continuous delivery, please. They realized they had a problem. They had 300 testers, 300 developers. They had 70 million lines of code for reasons I won't go into on this particular talk. But they had some problems, and they decided they needed a team to solve these problems and to be able to start automating their build and their deployments. And so they created a DevOps team. But this DevOps team wasn't just one team. This was a DevOps team of 4 teams. And those 4 teams were the test automation team, the merging team, the build team, and the deployment team. The test automation team, they'd established that they didn't have any automated tests and they needed them, so there was a team that was building some test automation using a tool that had a 6-month learning curve, but I'm not going to go into that. The merging team was responsible for merging together 6 branches every time they wanted to do a release. Because they didn't want the developers wasting time doing merging, they let another team do that because the developers are all fully utilized, so we'll have another team doing merging. The third team was the build team, so they were responsible for packaging up the application, and they were the only ones who were doing anything remotely sensible. They'd actually gone, maybe we should use one of those tools that already exist in the ecosystem, and we'll use TeamCity and we'll use NuGet to package up the application. However, the deploy team decided to use PowerShell, which is fine. I'll get onto the awesomeness of PowerShell later. But they were building a tool for PowerShell. So rather than having all the developers and people having to understand how to learn and use PowerShell, they would build a tool that everyone could use, which is also fine. I understand that because PowerShell is kind of ugly. But what I couldn't understand is that they had no visibility of what was happening in this DevOps pipeline. So not only did they not know what the developers are doing and whether something was done or not, they also didn't know, once it went into the test automation team, where it was. When it went into the build team, it was probably the only one that had visibility. When it went into the deploy tool, we don't know what's happening there. And their way of communicating with each other was to drop files into an FTP location, then other people would pick them up, which meant that they had no way of doing versioning. And so the really important factor there is that The build and deployment tool is an orchestration tool and should be treated as such, and the tools available to do that are TeamCity and Go. This brings me on to TFS and why you shouldn't use it. And the reason I put this in here, specifically talking about build, is because the build part of continuous delivery in Windows is actually a solved problem, and TFS does not solve the problem for you. And it has two problems. First one is it sucks at source control management. So it sucks for these two reasons. A developer can check in without pulling the latest code, and TFS won't tell you that it did that, or you did that. And then you can push your code, and the TFS will merge it for you, and then your build will break, which is painful, and then nobody else can check in. And so that's one of the reasons I hate it. The second one is because you can't commit locally. So the argument I get from developers that use this tool are like, yeah, we've got shell sets now, we can't. And I'm like, well, no, you can't, because it doesn't give you any record of what's been happening. It's not like with Git where you can rebase and put your commit where you want it and have a good understanding of what's happened in the timeline of your commits. It doesn't do anything like that. It just doesn't give you a good way to track what's happened with your code. So why stab yourself in the eye while you're trying to manage your code? Just don't use it. And just to prove the fact that it's not so good at what it does, Microsoft built a bridge for Git for it. Or somebody did, and then they built their own. But that's beside the point. But if you are going to use TFS, the source control management is the least worst of the things that it does. The worst one it does is this thing called team build. Now, there's a reason I'm not calling this CI or a build tool or anything, and I'm just calling it what it is because it doesn't give you the features that I actually want from my orchestration tool, which is the ability to see what's happening and where something is in the process, and also the ability to decide when this step is finished, I want to do this step. So when my tests have passed, I want to then deploy it, or I want to run these sets of tests. It doesn't do any of that. It has a very sequential structure by default, and it's very, very hard to adjust. So it doesn't have any support for pipelines, which is why I love Go, because you get great visibility of what's going on, and TeamCity is also introducing that. And it's also really, really hard to adjust it, which brings me on to one of my, I guess, biggest Windows rants, full stop, is the reason it's so hard to adjust is because it's written in this. And XML is wonderful. It's used for the internet, for creating documents. XML is not code. It's not maintainable. It's hard to understand. I don't know if people have previously worked with Nant or MS Build or any of those in the past. But my experiences are, OK, this target here. OK, let me do a Control-F across all these files and find out where this target goes to. OK, now I do a Control-F across all these files and find out where this target goes to. And before you know it, you're like, I have no idea what is going on here. Why make it hard for yourself? I like to use actual code when I'm coding. And in the DevOps world, we're always talking about infrastructure as code, and I just don't think XML is code. XML is just painful. But unfortunately, for the foreseeable future, a lot of the tools that are coming out of Microsoft and that are in the Windows domain are XML. And that's one of the key things that I would like to see change. So if you don't want to use XML and you don't want to use MS Build, which is, I guess, the one after Nant, you can use the wonderful PowerShell, which I love. Because it's so powerful. And I'll talk a bit more about some of the things it can do when I'm talking about deploy and provisioning environments. But PowerShell can do just about anything you want to do on Windows. But if you don't like PowerShell because it's ugly, some awesome person also created this, which is kind of like rake or make. And so we like code. We don't like XML. Now that we've compiled and run our unit tests, I just want to talk about packaging. So for the people in the .NET world in the room, does anyone remember the time before we had NuGet or new? Yes? That just I'm going to build this DLL, and I'm just going to FTP it somewhere, and the ops guy is going to pick it up and drop it for me. And if it doesn't work, he's going to be like, that didn't work. I'm like, it's OK, I'll build a new one, and I'm in Visual Studio, and I'm going to rebuild my DLL again, and I'm going to put it into release mode, and I put it into debug mode, and it didn't work again, and it's like, okay, can I just send you the .cs files, and then I can actually change them myself if I need to, and yeah, sorry, I did do that. Yes. We now have NuGet, which is awesome, so we can manage external and third-party software, and we can also manage our own, and package things up, not just with the code, but also with the configuration. And the cool thing about NuGet is it came from the alt.NET community. Originally, it was new, and it was a DSL. But then they joined forces with Microsoft, I guess to get wider uptake, and they made it XML, and that made me sad. OK, so that was the easy one. You've built the application. You're not using TFS, and you're using PowerShell or Saki or something cool like that. Now we want to actually deploy our application. So this is where it starts to get a little bit harder. But it's post 11 a.m., so if you feel like cracking open a beer, I'm English, I don't judge. Let's have a look at our deployment pipeline. It's just this easy little step here. And you could be deploying to any environment, your SIT, your staging environment. You might even be deploying to production environment, but you can have good visibility in your orchestration tool. But what's happening under the hood? Apart from that. Or how do we do this? So we want to be able to, I want to go back, sorry. Got way too many transitions in my slide. So what we're always really trying to do is we're going to get the artifacts that we've packaged up, and we want to deploy it to an environment and configure that environment in the way that we need to. And there's a couple of different ways to do that. So usually the first thing people say to me is, oh, just use msdeploy. And msdeploy is XML, so by default, I hate it. It's also kind of hard and difficult to understand and kind of hard to learn. And it does have some cool features, like it can configure IIS for you, and you can set up your application configuration and things like that. But it can get really unwieldy really quickly, and I don't like that, so just use PowerShell. Because PowerShell is code, and I like code. And PowerShell is really powerful. It can do, like I say, it can completely configure IIS. It can run and start services for you. It can interrupt with the component object model, any web services. It can also interact with your Windows management instrumentation, which is how you do infrastructure automation with PowerShell. It's really, really powerful. But there's also some new kids on the block that make this also a little bit easier. So I don't know if people have started to hear about Octopus recently, but I had a little play with this, and basically you can install tentacles onto your servers. It'll set up a secure connection for you, and then you can deploy the application. And this can also like hook in and configure IIS for you, and restart services and other cool stuff like that. So there's a lot of different ways of doing this, and by default, I would pretty much always go with PowerShell and see whether Octopus can do also what you need it to do. But there is pain with trying to deploy on Windows. So let's talk a little bit about that. The first one is there's no one way to package in the Windows environment. Some people use MSIs. Even SQL Server is not packaged in a standard way. It uses this .ini file, which also makes it really hard to kind of script a lot of deployment of certain packages. So it may be really easy to create your own applications and components in a standard way and deploy, and that's all wonderful. But as soon as you start dealing with third-party applications, then you're going to start dealing with all the pain of the way that they've set up their environments, or sorry, set up their applications. And some of them, even worse than that, not using MSIs, they're only allowed you to set up through the GUI. So anyone who remembers Click Once will remember the GUI way of deploying applications. Even worse than that, some of them, even if they do allow you some standard way of packaging themselves, don't have that much access through the command line. So even NuGet Package Manager has better support through the console than it does through the command line, which is just painful. And then there's no way to actually just install packages like you can in Linux using yum or apt or whatever. That doesn't really exist at the moment. And that doesn't even get me onto the pain of database migrations, because that's a whole separate talk of how painful that is. In most enterprises that I encounter, they have excessive amounts of SQL and stored procedures. And I see stored procedures kind of like XML, hard to test, hard to understand, hard to maintain. And often you have to overcome that problem as well. But even the deployment that's actually not too hard. When it starts to get really painful is provisioning environments. This is where you're really going to start hitting some of the problems of trying to do DevOps in Windows. And so because this is so difficult, I always think about why do we want to do this? And so I always ask people, how long does it take you to create an environment? Or if this environment blew up, how long do you think it would take to get it back up and running? And I asked a client that recently, and they were like, oh, I don't really know. And I was like, well, what would you need to do? And they were like, well, first I'd have to go through all the email chains. And I'm like, what do you mean the email chains? It's like, well, every time somebody changes some configuration, we email each other and tell each other. And so the problem that they have is they have these beautiful work of art servers, and the source control for the configuration of the servers is Outlook. So let me tell you a story, a second story. I hope you guys aren't completely asleep yet. Oop, gone too far. I was on a client that decided to create their own build and deployment tool. Even though there are build tools out there, there's TeamCity and Go. I'm just going to keep saying that, and maybe somebody will listen to me. They decided to build their own, because they were like, oh, we can do everything in PowerShell. We'll just build our own. It's like, OK, fine. I think they'd started with building a deployment tool, and then they decided to build an everything tool. And it was all kind of munched together, and it was very hard to see where something was in the process. And they hadn't used any great patterns to do that. But it had this really awesome feature that we accidentally came upon, which was you could actually log into the server. You could check into the server, so you could be like, oh, I just want to remove this folder. And somebody removed the entire directory that the build and deployment tool lived in and completely blew up the entire build tool. And so one day it's like, oh, the build's broken. It's like, oh, no, actually, the build tool seems to be broken. It was gone completely. Thankfully, we could get hold of the source code because we'd backed up. We could get yesterday's backup. But in terms of the actual rebuilding of that server, it took 2 days. And then by the time, because everyone's still coding away, by the time we were all back where we needed to be, it took an entire week. And this is not uncommon. I mean, it's uncommon to completely blow out your CI and deployment tool. That was just kind of funny, and that just gave us a lot of leverage to be able to implement some changes in that space. But it's not uncommon for creating environments to take an inordinate amount of time. So let's talk about how we would do that. How do we set up an environment in Windows? And what do we need to do? So we need to create the actual machines. We need to configure them. We need to set up the operating system. We need to set up the network. We need to do all of these different things. And the simplest way to do that, or the simplest way I've seen that done, is to just create some kind of virtual machine. And you can do that with VirtualBox or VMware or any of those things. And I would start with just a couple of base images. Either you're going to configure them as you go through your pipeline, or have a base image to start with. But at the very least, you're going to start with you're going to need some kind of development environment. And you're not going to put too many things on here, things that aren't likely to change very often, like the version of Visual Studio. Maybe you need SQL Server. Maybe you need the framework. And you'll probably also want to create a CI just in case somebody blows it up one day, which, as I've told you, can happen. And then you're probably going to want some kind of prod-like images. And these prod-like images might just start with one, but you might also have like a web server and an app server and a database server. But some way of just easily creating an image. And a common pattern I've seen is to have these images kind of set up and then just take them and use them as you want, or configure through the pipeline what you need as and when you need to, or people completely creating the environment from scratch. In fact, one guy, when I was telling him about doing this talk, said to me, a couple of years ago, he was so afraid of like Windows Update and random stuff that was happening in Windows when he was creating environments that basically every single day they ran an MSI that scripted the entire environment from scratch every day because they were so worried about what was happening in the background and that anything might have changed from day to day. But there's a very cool new kid on the block that allows you to do a lot of these system packages right from the start, and that's Chocolatey. Which I would definitely recommend. And more applications and tools are being able to be installed through Chocolatey, which is kind of like, I think it's kind of like Yum or apt-get that you have on Linux. It's very cool. It works with PowerShell and NuGet, and it'll allow you to do this. And I'm just going to just sidestep quickly into why we want to do virtualization at all. It basically just allows you to have these environments ready, so that if anything goes wrong, you can just recreate it. And in Windows, you can now use the cloud. Yay! So you can do this with Amazon. We've done this at Thoughtworks examples with Amazon, and I think even I'm sure you can do this with Azure. I've never actually used Azure, but I'm sure you can do this. But the point is that most systems will be slightly different. So you might have like a CI and a development and prod-like systems, and prod-like might be several systems. But it's rare that the systems are all the same. And things like a lot of Windows admin guys will be like, oh, I'll just use SCOM for this. And SCOM kind of works on the idea that like everything is kind of the same. And that's rarely the case. Which is why I say, forget SCOM, create some kind of virtual environment, whether it's a local or it's private or public cloud, or not necessarily public, but not necessarily owned by you. And you can do this using Puppet, Chef, and PowerShell, which about a year ago you couldn't. And what we're talking about here, as I said, is infrastructure as code. So let's just talk a little bit about Puppet, Chef, and PowerShell and what you can do with them now. So PowerShell, you can do everything. It is the god of Windows. It works completely with like Windows management instrumentation. It uses Windows features. It can use all the commandlets. So basically anything that's available on the Windows Server API, the PowerShell can run it, can do it. It can access it. However, be careful of versions. If you're using anything older than Windows Server 2008, just, I don't know, forget about it. Basically, from 2008 is when the PowerShell support came in, and from that point, you can start doing more and more things in terms of automating your environment setup. But before then, you're probably going to be in a whole world of pain. So you can do everything with PowerShell, but it's ugly. It's very procedural language, and it's very easy to make a complete mess of it. So you have to be very careful about creating clear abstractions and, okay, these are my pre-scripts, these are the scripts, these are the post-scripts, and keeping everything very clean and tidy. However, I know that obviously in Linux we've had Puppet and Chef for a while, which allow you to have idempotency, which is a good thing, because I don't want like random changes to happen or side effects to happen when I'm running scripts. And you can now, there's more and more support happening in this space in Windows. And basically, anything that you can't do with these tools, so these tools allow you to decide what the configuration of the server is. Anything you can't do with these, you can call straight out to PowerShell. So in ThoughtWorks projects, we actually started by doing Chef, because Chef supports that calling out to scripts by default. And as more and more support in the Windows environment turned up in Chef and in Puppet, we basically removed the PowerShell bits as we went. But anything that you can't do in Chef and Puppet, you can do in PowerShell. So normally, when I'm starting on this journey with a team, we usually start with PowerShell, and I've seen a lot of teams start with PowerShell because it's a Microsoft-supported tool, and people kind of buy into that. But as I've said, because it is its own language, it is kind of hard to learn, it is kind of ugly. People then end up building their own tools. And because people are doing that, I would now say, don't start with PowerShell. Decide whether you're going to use Puppet or Chef. Start with one of those, and as soon as you run into something that you can't access through the API or through the Windows server, with Puppet or Chef, you can call out to PowerShell or you can call out to WinRM. However, I've just made it sound like it's really, really easy, and that is such a lie. Yes, there are things that you can do with Puppet and PowerShell. Well, there are things that you can do with Puppet and Chef, and yes, you can do lots and lots of things with PowerShell. But it isn't that simple. It's fine and dandy when you're just working with your own applications, but you're going to have to start working with everyone else's applications. So it looks like you want to try and configure some servers, which is cool. Can you help me with that? Some of the pain is inherently built into the way that Microsoft tools work, the way the Windows servers work. And some of the pain is other people who've also built tools. So let's talk through each of the pain points. The first one is proprietary software. So I talked a little bit about how they don't have like a standard way to be packaged up and a standard way to be installed, which makes them extremely painful. There's also the licensing issue. So this is a really common problem of when we're trying to do continuous delivery in a big Windows enterprise, and they have all these tools, and it's like, yeah, well, we can't like have tons and tons of virtual servers, and we can't spin up like 3 test environments because we're only allowed like one of those tools because it costs like $1 billion. So if you spin up 10 environments, that's going to cost us $10 billion. And that is just like the stupidest reason not to be able to test something. So this is one that really just annoys the hell out of me. And the only real way to solve it, at least in the first instance, is you kind of have to create stubs of what that environment, or what that third-party software is doing so that you can test against it, but you're not really testing against the real thing. And so the only way to solve this problem is just stop buying this stupid, crappy software that you can only buy one of. The second thing you'll hit is Windows version. So as I say, if you're using earlier than 2008, you're just going to be in a whole world of pain. And the reason for that is because pre-2008, there wasn't this accessibility into the different commandlets in the server. There wasn't this accessibility into the API. And so it's very, very hard to try and automate anything when you basically have to log on to the server. The third one is remoting. So I talked a little bit about, if you can't do it in PowerShell, or you can't do it in Puppet or Chef, you can just use WinRM. But WinRM is hard, it's fiddly, and you have to be on a trusted domain, and there's all these all of these things just become really painful. The next problem you're going to face is with registries. So we have like 64-bit and 32-bit registries. Now, as far as I know, the Puppet process runs on the 32-bit registry, so anything you're trying to do on the 64-bit registry, you're going to jump through like 7 levels of hell to try and get it to work. And you're going to find that at some point you're going to end up debugging the registries and figuring out what configuration changes you need to make. Yeah, that's painful. The next one is Windows updates. So, as we know, Windows likes to update itself. I mean, it's not like it turns the server off, but when you restart it and turn it back on, it says 99 updates coming your way. It's like, damn it, that's going to take ages. You can hook into SCOM and basically automate the admin of Windows updates. So this can be done. So it's not like this isn't in the, oh my God, I can't do this, I give up kind of world. This is more in the, oh, this is just something painful that I have to deal with. The next one of those is the fact that this isn't installed by default. So you still need to install a virtual clone drive to do any kind of mounting. And that's just like, why do I have to keep doing that? The next one, or the final one, is just the cost of doing this. So even on Azure, it's more expensive to set up Windows environments than it is Linux environments. Licensing is just more expensive. But despite all of this pain, Windows is here to stay. And the reason I'm talking about this and putting all this up here is because this fundamentally these are the issues that you will hit. But it's not impossible. These things, it can be done. And these things are being worked on all the time, which is good. But what can you do? How can you make it better? So the first thing, or the one that I struggle with the most, is getting people to not be afraid of using tools that are not Microsoft tools. Because before NuGet, we were just picking up DLLs and dropping them wherever we wanted. And before Chef and Puppet, it's literally just PowerShell or do it manually. And so we can learn from the other environments that we're in and use their tools. And the funny thing is actually this morning I was sat having a coffee, and Dan North plonked himself down next to me, and he was like, so what's your talk about? And I told him, and he was like, so basically you can do everything with PowerShell. And I was like, yeah, except what you can't do. And he was like, well, that means you could do it all in IronPython. That was it, IronPython. And I was like, huh, really? And he's like, yeah, you should look into that. And I thought, that's a really good idea. So maybe one of you guys could do that. Which brings me to this. Leverage existing languages that aren't necessarily PowerShell or .NET languages. Because a lot of these things can do what we want them to do, and we don't have to use XML. I would rather learn like Ruby or Python than play with XML. The next thing is, if a tool doesn't exist and the language doesn't do it, so maybe all that IronPython can do right now is just access the DLR or the CLR and do a lot of things in that space, but it can't access things in the Windows Server environment. So contribute and build it. The other thing is, because Windows is here to stay, and yes, we know this stuff is hard, but it won't get any better if we don't just do it. It's like, I feel like half the time just saying, stop whining about it, yes, it's hard, but it won't get any better if you don't do it, because as developers, as soon as we start doing something that's really hard, we think, hold on a minute, how can we make this better? And so it's just like anything in sort of continuous delivery, a lot of it is about continuous improvement. Look at all the pain points that we have, and let's just pick one off and see how we can fix it. And that just do it is really, it's not so much about the tools and technology, it's more about a mindset. The biggest problem I find in Windows is actually that generally you're working in the enterprise and people don't like change or they find it very hard. And so really it's about getting people to just start doing this stuff and start solving these problems. But I feel I've depressed you a little bit, so let's let's end on a happier note. It can only get better, right? Think about where we were even just 2 years ago. Things are a lot better. Like, I mean, a couple of years ago when I said I was doing this, people would just be like, oh my God, you can't do that. Just like get them all on Linux. Like, you can't do what you're trying to do. Now it's like, well, actually you can, but you'll face this, 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 and this issue. And how I feel about it is, well, we're just going to start tackling each one of those issues. So things have got to get better unless Microsoft does a complete turnaround and turns PowerShell into XML or something. And then I give up. Then it's flip the keyboard, I give in. I go to Linux. Things are happening all the time. I think Sasha's doing a talk on Chef after this, and maybe she'll give us some more insight into what they're doing in Windows. But you know, we have support in those tools to do this now. We can make a start. Maybe we can convince people to stop buying proprietary software that doesn't have a standard way of installing or packaging, doesn't have any kind of command line, and costs like $1 billion for every single license. For me, as a consultant, I go into an environment and I'm there to solve problems. That's my job. And so the first step to that problem solving is going, okay, what are all the problems? Which is the biggest problem causing the most pain? Which one can I fix? And that's really like my call out to the community. It's like, I've told you what all the problems are, all the things that I'm facing. Let's start fixing some of that. That's it. Thank you. I think I left enough time for questions.
Loads of questions. They're very popular.
Oh, dear.
Okay. It's all fairly legal. So just while we're sifting through these questions, if you've got anything else to ask, just use the app, and then maybe we'll resort to people waving their hands, although I'm not as fit as I used to be, so I'll just refresh them. So maybe just answer anyone you want.
Okay. Where do I start?
I don't know what that one is.
Oh, the first one. Is cruise control Go now? Yes, I think so, right?
Cruise control is open source thing, so it's different.
Yeah, well, no, I know it's different, but we used to use cruisecontrol.net in the .NET environment, which was open source, but I think Go you actually have to pay for, like you do with TeamCity. So I guess the answer to that question is kind of. How about visualizing pipelines in Jenkins or Bamboo? I've not used either of those, but they're open source, right? And I guess you could.
Jenkins is Bamboo's commercial.
Do they have visualization if pipelines in either of those?
Find me afterwards, we'll talk about it.
Okay, I mentioned click once in the past tense. Why is that? Because it was 10 years ago when I first used it. And at the time, I was like, oh, this is really cool, because I can just deploy my application by pressing, like, in Visual Studio, and it creates this web page, and I press deploy, and off it goes. But all that really does is, like, deploy and set up IIS. Like, it doesn't do anything more complicated than that, and it can't be automated, so, like, as in by a tool. So I use it in the past tense, because I would just never use it now, because I'm never creating just, like, some dummy website. Usually I just laugh when people say click once. Sorry. Okay, what's your take on chocolatey.org's role, Windows Package Manager, in regards to CD? Oh, I don't know whether I mentioned that. Yeah, I think Chocolatey is awesome, actually. Its limitations are really around the packages that it can actually, at the moment, get hold of and install. But I've been using it on development environments for the past couple of months, and it seems to be working pretty well. I'm not sure if the team that I've just left they were talking about figuring out whether we could do that also in the rest of the pipeline and deploy, but we hadn't taken it much further than that. But I think it's promising. What's the next one? Can you share on GitHub a sample collection of scripts, PowerShell, Saki, which work for you and do deployment right in IIS? Probably I would have to look at anonymizing them all first, but yes, I will look into doing that.
So we've probably got time for some questions from the floor. If anyone wants to wave a hand, I can try and run up the stairs. No? I thought somebody might wave their hand just to see me running up the
It's all right.
stairs.
I haven't finished.
Oh, you haven't finished? Okay, carry on.
No. Okay, what are the packaging tools that you would recommend for Windows? Okay, so I've used NuGet quite a lot and in anger, and apart from the fact that it's XML-based, which is kind of annoying, I know there's also OpenWrap, which is written by one of the alt.NET community guys. I've heard that's pretty cool, but I haven't used it. And I think you can also use Artifactory in Windows these days as well. Yeah, but I've used NuGet. TFS is not that bad. Remember Visual Source Safe. There is a chance that TFS will rock in a few decades.
I think that's positive thinking for you.
Yay. Okay, I do remember Visual Source Safe. I remember losing an entire code base with Visual Source Safe. Just one. And actually, I'd only been at the job a week. And it was my first job in London, and I was like, oh, God, I'm going to get sacked. And I told my boss, and he just started laughing and went, Visual Source Safe sucks, man. I can't answer that. Like, I just don't understand why people are using TFS. And what I find is that the arguments, they're never rational. They're always completely like irrational arguments. Or they're like, well, we've already paid for it because of our MSCN licensing or whatever. And I'm like, so what? Just there's loads of other free tools that are better. Just stop using it. Until it gets better, I'm not saying anything else. Okay. This is a really long question. Okay, I might have to, whoever asked this, I might have to talk, just try and understand the question afterwards, but I'll come back to that one. Oh, so what is the reason to not just use Linux? Because that's not usually my decision. So generally, the problem is that the environments that you're working in, they've already decided and bought into Windows and spent money on it, and they've got this whole sunk cost thing going on. It's rare that you get to have that argument or that choice. If you're just about to start building something from scratch, or you're in an environment that's from scratch, I guess you could go with Linux, but I don't have that much experience of using it anyway. But it's not usually my choice. Okay, would it make sense to use NuGet for deployment and configuration? I don't know how that would work.
That's a maybe then.
Whoever asked that question and the other one about, so you can clone a complete environment, like a complete image, this would give you a reproducible snowflake. If your machine dies, you can roll your clone again. With Puppet and Chef, you write scripts to set up your system, which to choose, how much, and of each. I think we should probably talk about that.
Offline, so I think we're at time now. So we'll say once again, thanks very much for Rachel, and thanks for your questions.